This is the Series 6 chapter of suitability, customer suitability. I'm Colin Kleck, representing millionairesintraining.com. It's my pleasure to be on this Series 6 journey with you. So now what we're going to do in chapter 7 here is we're going to cover everything that has to do with customer accounts. So let's take a look. When you're putting all of the customer information together, three critical things that we look at include client information, their investment objective, and making that suitable recommendation. As a reminder from the previous chapter, there are suitability measures. Now, number one, you always want to plan your attack as a registered rep. You want to always think like a regulator when it comes to these three standards. Reasonable basis. Is this a fund that would be reasonable for this type of investor in generic? Customer specific. Now, is that product good for that specific person, John Doe? And then finally, quantitative suitability. We cannot make the investor invest more money than what they have available. So can they afford this? So anything that you see suitability where the customer is going to take out like a bank loan or borrow against a mortgage to make an investment, that's a big no-no. That doesn't qualify as suitable under quantitative measures. Suitability factors that we take a look at. The first thing that we take a look at is the investor's age, if they provide us with that information. Our assumption is that younger investors have a longer term investment time horizon and they can assume more risk. So aggressive growth funds can be more suitable for younger investors than your senior or middle-aged counterparts. Middle-aged investors would look for a mix of growth and income securities, while senior citizens would base their investment on more fixed income products that provide consistent income to live off of. Another suitability factor we'd look at is the marital status and the number of dependents for the investor. The recommendations for one person, one family is going to be different than a 5% family. Do they have children? Are they wanting to save for college? Do they want to send their kids to private high school? How are they saving for that? Covered LESAs or 529 plans, and then how are they preparing for unseen circumstances? Maybe they have a family member with special needs or an elderly parent who needs extra support. Other suitability factors include investment experience and product knowledge. So on our timeline, we have first-time investors and then we have our seasoned investors. Most of these firms use self-evaluation for their clients. So this is typically one of our categories where they go in and do our own self-assessment. None, which is I have no experience with it whatsoever, limited a year or less of investment experience. I have good experience or extensive investment experience. Here's the best tip I can give to you when you're trying to answer suitabilities on a test. Never assume that the investor understands anything, especially risk. Another suitability factor is the investment time horizon. How long does the investor plan on holding the investment, and then how long do they need it to work for them? And then where do they need the money? So one of the things that I'll always encourage you to remember is that time horizon ends up being one of the very most important items when doing suitability on this test. If you notice that an investor has a very, very short time horizon or may want the money very soon, you may want to invest them in things like fixed income, things that are safe and stable, and cash, money market funds with a year or less maturity. A money market fund would be best. And then there's longer term time horizons that would especially increase the amount of equity or stock in a portfolio. This allows for greater exposure to market ups and downs. The securities are more volatile, and typically these outperform fixed income over a longer period of time. So what amount of risk tolerance? Remember, just because the investor says that they're aggressive doesn't necessarily mean that they really can be suitable for those if they're not willing to stay in the fund long enough. Risk really means that the uncertainty of the outcome. And the most important piece is this risk tolerance, but it's very difficult to figure out. So whenever we've talked about self-assessed risk level, or when an investor has lower risk, they're not willing to accept much risk, or in order to achieve their investment goals, they have the ability to take more risk, right? The high risk side, they can take on more risk to accomplish targets for their investments. The thing that you always want to remember is the greater the risk, then the greater the reward over time. So what we're going to talk about here is the risks now from highest to lowest. So let's take a look at some of our younger investors who are willing to accept some risk. So here's our risk level. This is a risk taker, an aggressive growth seeker. Suitable funds are aggressive funds like technology fund, sector-specific funds, and hedge funds. As a side note, with a Series 6, we cannot offer hedge funds, but a Series 7 rep can. What's not suitable for your aggressive growth risk taker are U.S. government funds, Ginnie Mae funds, and any other debt type of funds that produce income. Debt is non-aggressive, it's income producing asset. And then you have your risk tolerant investor who's seeking growth. Suitable investment for this investor would be growth or a value fund. International funds, they could do that if they wanted to. That's outside the U.S., speculating in foreign currencies and foreign companies. Things that are too risky and are not suitable, those too risky securities would be like a technology fund. And then the two conservative securities for a growth investor would be a U.S. government. So what about the investor who can take moderate risk for moderate growth? So moderate investors, that's really where a lot of people are from the age of 30 to 45 are in their stage of life. They value income in a stock portfolio along with some growth. So when you see this income with value, it's an equity income fund and a value fund. They invest in stocks. What's not suitable is an international fund because investing outside of the United States is typically too much risk for a moderate investor. So what about investors who are not seeking any risk? They're a little bit more conservative. Let's say you have a risk avoider who they're adverse to risk. They don't want to take any risk. Their money is important to them. They don't want to have risk outstanding. I might put this investor in a balance or asset allocation fund, right? What's really nice about balance and asset allocation is that they invest in both stocks and bonds. What's not suitable for this type of investor would be an international fund. If you have an investor who can assume little risk and they're looking for, let's say, a higher degree of safety, once we see that term, high degree of safety, the suitable investment becomes U.S. government funds and Ginnie Mae funds, which what is not suitable for people with a higher degree of safety would be growth or sector specific portfolios. What if you have an investor who's in a very high tax bracket and is really, really worried about tax risk because they're in such a high tax bracket that they're looking to pay as little tax as possible, not have Uncle Sam take all their income, right? Maybe a municipal bond fund, right? What's not suitable would be a corporate bond fund where interest is taxable. Virtually no risk, or somebody seeking preservation of capital, would be any type of money market fund. What's not a suitable investment for preservation of capital would be an aggressive growth or an aggressive portfolio, just to name a few. Suitability factors. Let's take a look at the idea of volatility. How does the value of money invest in go up and down as the market changes? How do we measure securities volatility when comparing it to the market as a whole is through a measurement called beta. How the value of money invested goes up and down as the market changes. How do we measure the securities volatility when compared to the market as a whole is through a measurement called beta. A security that has a beta of 1 has the same volatility as the market. A security that has a higher than 1 beta has more volatility than the overall market, while a security with a beta of less than 1 is less volatile. Duration is interest rate and volatility in prices associated with debt. Other risk factors include inflation. Can they afford to lose purchasing power risk over that time period due to inflation? Money spends less in the future as it does today. That rising fluctuation of interest rates. Or not interest rates, but interest of the overall economy. So inflation is, can they afford to lose the purchasing power over the period of time due to inflation? Fluctuations in income. Does the investment income cover everyday expenses? Can they tolerate the change if there is a depletion in income? Liquidity needs. Importance to the rainy day fund to keep cash available, 3 to 6 months of living expenses for unexpected emergencies and unseen circumstances. Sometimes we have an investor that might have a bunch in savings and they might be wealthy, so they want to invest like 100% in equities at 80 years old. Here's the thing, if that 80-year-old has the retirement plan and their money saved, and this is just another investment so that they can have some max or mad money, then that's suitable. Let's go ahead and invest it. But I know that's not a normal situation, but for time to time, we have older wealthy investors who can make very, very aggressive investments, and they're ready to take some risk, some party money. You see that every once in a while. Another suitability factor is determining the financial status of a client. We determine this by looking at personal income statements. This includes the client's yearly income and expenses, their lifestyle, and is there any money left for investing? Very few people can make more income and not increase their lifestyle. A personal balance sheet is just a snapshot of the client's finances in a moment of time. So it shows the wealth, but not how they attained it. So additional considerations include knowing your customer. Know your customer, well, that means asking the appropriate questions to understand what their exact needs are and to get relevant information about them and their livelihoods. So in addition to investable assets that are held at that firm, there is also required about all assets which are held away from the firm. So outside investments, that just means we look at the client's complete financial picture. So not just a single piece. That includes, but is not limited to, participation in retirement plans, whether it's a 401k or an IRA or a pension plan. Current tax deductions, like their 401ks, reduces your current income and taxes. Matching contributions from an employer, tax-deferred earnings from those qualified plans, and life insurance, variable, fixed, and etc. Let's talk about suitability objectives. There are 3 main objectives. First, capital appreciation or growth. This is for younger investors. I'm going to put this much money in today, and when I take the money out eventually in 10 or 20 years from now, I want to take it out substantially higher price than I put it in at. Preservation of capital. This is really where investors who don't want to lose their principal investment that they're putting in, they don't want to risk it. People who have preservation of capital usually need that money for a specific purpose, like short term, they're buying a house, you put them in a money market. And then finally, the older we get, the more income we want to receive with the securities in our retirement plan to live on. So current income is that third investment objective. So when the investor is talking about preservation of capital and liquidity, some different examples include preservation of capital, short-term, high-grade corporate money market instruments, short-term U.S. government treasury money market funds, short-term, high-grade municipal money market funds are always where we can save money to preserve our capital. I don't want to lose the money I'm putting in. The next thing is liquidity. That typically overlaps preservation of capital. So how do we know an investor is looking for liquidity? Is that they're looking for a cash equivalent. Remember, money market funds, depending on the NAV of the dollar, are always a great choice. High income earners will benefit from tax-free money market funds. See that note there? That is testable. The higher your tax bracket is, the more beneficial tax reinvesting will become. So remember, a registered rep cannot guarantee a money market fund will maintain its stated goal of retaining $1 for the NAV. I know you're wondering, Colin, can we look at a question related to this? Of course we can. So Amy is a 25-year-old pastry chef, and she'd like to set aside $50,000 in an investment to buy a new house soon. Which of the following mutual funds would be the best option for Amy? Well, things that I know here, just really quick. She's young, she's only 25 years old, and she's a pastry chef. She wants $50,000 to be set aside to buy a new house soon. So she needs that money soon. She's young and needs the money soon. Whenever we need the money soon, your fund radar should go off and say money market. So anytime an investor needs the money soon, it should be some type of money market account because time horizon always supersedes the age. It takes priority over her age. So I know that it's not going to be an aggressive growth fund, right? So let's get rid of that. And it won't be a high yield fund. It's not that because we said anytime we need the money soon, it's always going to be a money market. Now, which one is the best answer choice here? Does it say in the question that Amy is wealthy or in a high tax bracket? It doesn't. It doesn't say anything about her being wealthy. We cannot make that assumption. So now we're going to get rid of C, which is the tax-free money market fund. That leaves B as the correct answer choice. So now let's talk about current income. Current income is derived from funds that invest in primarily bonds. So our different type of bonds, if you have a conservative investor, it's a US government fund. If you have somebody who wants monthly income, that's a Ginnie Mae fund because people pay their mortgages monthly. If we want bonds with diversity, if we don't want to give up our bond, municipal bond, or US government bonds based on the further needs of the client. So if we're looking at a current income of the investment objective and the investor is in a low tax bracket, that just means that the investor is in a tax bracket that is lower than 28%. Here, the investors must concern about income. They don't really care about the tax implication. They want to earn more money. So when we invest in an investor here is an investment grade corporate bond fund, a Ginnie Mae fund if we want monthly income because people pay their mortgages monthly, or even income REITs. We can't sell REITs with a Series 6, only a Series 7 rec can sell them. If you have an investor in a 28% or higher tax bracket, or the question may ask you and tell you that the investor is successful. That's always your clue that the investor is in a really high tax bracket and they're more concerned about with income that's federally tax-free. By investing in a municipal bond fund or a tax-free money market fund will meet that investor's objective. Of course, let's go over another question. With Amy, our pastry chef, except this time she's going to be wealthy. So Amy is a 25-year-old successful pastry chef and she wants to set aside $50,000 in an investment to buy a new house soon. Which of the following mutual funds would be the appropriate option for Amy? A, a growth fund, B, a money market fund, C, a tax-free money market fund, or D, a high yield fund? Now, as you can see, I personally use a test-taking strategy where I read every single word in the question along with every answer choice, RTFQ, read the full question before I go for an answer. The reason why I do is I'm a quick test taker, and if I think I know the answer, I skip reading the rest of the question, or I don't look at all the answer choices, and that is a huge mistake on any of your FINRA or NASA exams. So if you're like me, let's read every word. Now, once we've read the entire question, let's go back and try and find our specific clues, giveaways for this question. So she's 25 years old and she's successful. That's our key word there, successful. She wants to invest $50,000 to buy a new house soon, right? So what is the best option for Amy? This is very similar to the last question we had. However, when they start to tell us that she is successful, what does that indicate? That indicates that Amy is in a high tax bracket. So the money she earns, she's going to have to pay a lot of tax on that income. So she knows that she needs the money soon, but she's successful. It's not going to be a growth or a high yield fund. We're narrowing it down to the two money market funds through a process of elimination. So which answer is correct? All right, you got it. The right answer is choice C, a tax-free money market fund. Because she is successful, she's in a higher tax bracket, she doesn't want to have to pay tax on the income that she makes in the portfolio. Option B would be appropriate if she were not successful, and we covered that in the other example of this question. So what about growth or capital appreciation? Clients are willing to accept some risk for growth. These are our patient investors that are okay waiting years and years for their investments to bear fruit. Growth investors are going to concentrate on common stock growth funds and aggressive growth stock funds for supplemental savings, and variable contracts with really solid equity subaccounts to supplement their retirement. If you're an investor who's conservative, invest in the S&P 500 index fund or a blue chip fund. Blue chips are the best of the best companies, or a global international fund. Blue chip funds are really good for those investors who want to invest in products that they know, household names. Aggressive growth investors could pick a small cap fund, emerging markets funds, or even a variable contract with an equity subcount mix with supplemental retirement. Right. So with speculative growth, the sector-specific fund could be appropriate. And remember that speculative growth, they're usually non-reoccurring expenses, a child's wedding, an expensive vacation, and they just want to set some extra money aside for some specific event. How about middle-of-the-road investors? These investors, they usually have like multiple objectives like growth and income, or maybe they have a specific ratio or percentage of stocks and bonds that they're interested in, right? So the things that these investors would invest in is growth and income funds, balance funds, convertible bond funds, equity income funds, and life cycle funds. When it comes to asset allocation, once you pick an investment objective, you want to take the steps to create a portfolio. So select the asset classes for both stocks and bonds. Determine the percentage of the target allocation for each class. Here's your hint. If the question gives you the client's age, their age is right about where their bond allocation should be. So if I have a 23-year-old investor and the portfolio has 25% in bonds, that's probably ideal as long as the other 75% is in stocks. So use the client's age as a gauge for the percentage of the debt portion that they should hold in their portfolio. The maximum ranges to each asset class based on market fluctuation, and select individual clients of securities within those asset classes. The SEC requires that you reaffirm the client's financial profile with a minimum of once every 3 years. Use the client's age as a percentage for the debt portion they should invest in. Decide minimum and maximum ranges for each asset class based on market fluctuations, and select individual funds or securities within those asset classes. The SEC requires that you reaffirm a client's financial profile with a minimum of once every 3 years. Having great customer service, I would very highly recommend to do it at least once per year biannually. The last thing I wanted to give to you guys is my own personal suitability cheat sheet, because there are some funds that have specific investment criteria to become very easy for the Series 6. So for example, if you have an investor that needs monthly income, if they have an answer choice of the Ginnie Mae fund, pick that fund. Why do we say that? Ginnie Mae funds are the only fund that automatically pay monthly income, because people pay their mortgages monthly. What if you have a wealthy investor seeking capital appreciation or liquidity? Since they're wealthy, it's a tax-free money market fund. The last thing I wanted to go over with you guys is my own personal suitability cheat sheet, because there are some funds that have specific investment criteria that become very easy for the Series 6. So for example, if you have an investor that needs monthly income, if one of your answer choices is Ginnie Mae, pick the Ginnie Mae fund and go to the next question. Why do I say that? Well, Ginnie Mae funds are the only fund that automatically pay monthly income because people pay their mortgages monthly. What if you have a wealthy investor who's seeking capital preservation or liquidity? If they're wealthy, it's a tax-free money market fund. Tax-free, right? If they want to invest in products that they know, it's a blue chip fund. If they're just seeking capital preservation and liquidity and they don't know what their tax bracket is, well, it's just a regular money market fund. Whenever they're asking about maximum diversification as a goal, the answer choice is an asset allocation fund. It is the most diversifiable fund. And then finally, if the investor wants to invest in a product that mirrors the market as a whole, but they don't want to pay a whole lot in fees, pick an index fund, something that mirrors or possibly just the S&P 500 index. In this class, we've reviewed customer profiles and investment objective for the Series 6. Now it's time to go over to millionairesintraining.com, read through the content and take your practice questions, review those answer choices and explanations, go back through and do a second recap over those exam questions that you missed, and then take a final exam quiz by clicking the final exam box and really test yourself with these questions until you can get high scores in the mid 80s, 90s, or if you're, trying to beat the thing, 100% our exams on millionairesintraining.com, ensuring you get a top-notch score on the day of your test. Take this serious. I want you to pass on your first try. It takes discipline and study, and we've already done all the hard work for you. You just need to use this content in our simulated tests to reinforce the information. You can use this to develop your team and others. Basically, it's an entire duplicatable licensing system for your team and everyone else's. So you can see why it's so important if you want to grow a financial agency to take this serious, learn this information, and use this same system for everybody else on your team to get licensed. Duplicate the process for the next guy. Well done, warrior. I'll see you in the next video.